And for the multi-dimensional arrays, what I'm going to do is, one, how do we create these arrays? By reading in the size from the console. Right? Everybody's favorite thing to do is reading from the console. Then, how do we create a method to analyze the array or do whatever logical conditions or logical statements we want to do for this array? So the first thing, as always, is to create our class, public class lecture. So let's finish it off. Final lecture. Public static void main string args. All right. So now, what do I need to read from the console? I ask you this question all the time.
Scanner.
Scanner, thank you. Scanner input equals new scanner. System.in. And I need to import the scanner if I want to use it. All right. Can anybody tell me how to declare a variable? If I want to get the size, right, it's going to be an integer. How do I declare a variable?
Int and whatever you want to call it.
Yep. Int, let's call it rows equals
new input, new input.
just input dot next int. Right. Int columns equals same thing, input dot next int. All right, cool. So give me something for this array to represent. So for example, a scoring table or grades or something of that nature. Can anybody give me a good example? Inventory, I don't know. I'll just make one up.
So grades is a good one.
All right, let's do grades. So the rows would represent students. The columns would represent assignments. All right, if we're talking about grades, each row is going to be a student. Each column would be their grade for the assignment. So let's create the array. Int, typically scores can have decimal points, so let's do double. Grades equals new double. How many rows do we have? Students. How many columns do we have? Assignments. Right. I'm going to prompt the user a couple of times. System.out.print. Please enter the number of students. I'm going to read in the number of students. And then again, system.out.println or print. Please enter the number of assignments. All right. So now, let's say I want to populate this array with grades, randomly generated scores, right? Randomly generated grades. What do I need in order to randomly generate numbers?
A random object.
Random.
A random object, correct. Random, rand equals new random. In order to use that, we do need to import our random. Java.util.random. All right. So we need 2 for loops in order to loop through a 2D array, right? It's 2-dimensional, so we need 2 for loops called nested for loops. The first one will go through each row. So for and I equals, in row equals 0. Row is less than grades dot length. That's how many rows there are. Row plus plus. Then we go through the columns for int call equals 0. Call less than grades, whatever row we're at, dot length. That tells me how many columns there are. Call plus plus. Now let's do some random grades between 0 and 100. Right? So let's say grades row column equals ran.nextInt 101. That gives me between 0 and 100. Now let's say some students perform better than others, right? Some students, they average around 80s and 90s. And some students, they run the whole gamut, right? But I know for a fact, and this is not indicative of this class, but let's say half the class, for example, scores between 80 and 90, right? They typically get B's and A's. The other half, it runs the whole gamut. So if I want to do that, I want to only do half the class. I could then, if I want to do that, only half the class gets certain grades and the other half doesn't. That means depending on what row I'm on, depending on which student I'm on, if it's higher than a certain number, they run the whole gambit. If it's less than a certain number, they average between 80s and 90s. So let's say, for example, 2 students average between 80 and 90, and the rest run the whole gambit, right? So what I can do is, inside this for loop, I could say, have an if statement. I know 2 students are going to have between 80 and 90. So if row is less than 2, so either row 1 or 2, I'm going to say grades at row call equals ran.nextInt, right? And then between, I want to say it's 21. That gives me a number between 0 and 20 plus 80. Basically, generate a random number between 0 and 21, then add 80 to it. That way, if I generate a 0, the minimum would be at 80. If I generate a 20, the maximum is 100. So these 2 students would get a grade between 80 and 100. Close that if statement. For all the other students, they run the entire gambit between 0 and 100. So if row is less than 2, so students 0 and 1, they're going to get grades between 80 and 100. Else, for all the other students, they're going to get grades between 0 and 100. All right, that's what I've done. 2 students have grades between 80 and 100. The rest have grades between 0 and 100. All right.
What does that 21 represent again?
The 21, I'm getting a random integer between 0 and 21. So it can either be 0 all the way up to 20. Then I add that to 80, right? That way, if I generate at 0, their minimum score will be an 80. If this ends up being a 0, 0 plus 80 equals 80. If I generate a 20, 20 plus 80 equals 100. That way I can get any number in between 80 and 100.
Got it. That makes sense.
All right, so the first 2 students are going to have grades between 80 and 100, and the rest are going to have grades between 0 and 100. Keep this in mind. This is going to be important for the lab and the assignment, I think. So keep this in mind. All right, the next thing I want to do, let's say I want to get the average score for assignment 0. All right, what's the average score for assignment 0? Well, obviously I could write that here, or I can write a method. So I'm going to close my main method. All right, that closes the main. I'm going to create another method outside the main, public double get average score. Get average score. I want to pass in a multi-dimensional array.
Sorry, what is the new method for again?
To get the average score of an assignment.
Okay, thank
So
you.
assignment 0, for example, I want to go through the entire assignment 0 and get the average score. All right. So I also want to get int assignment number. That'll basically be which assignment we're talking about. All right. And this, yeah, this is fine. Next in. Hopefully I won't get an error because the grades is a double, and then hopefully I don't get an error. If I do, I'll fix it. All right. So I want to iterate through each row, right? The column, I want to iterate through the entire column down, right? So for each student, I want to get their score for assignment, whatever, right here. Okay. So I'm going to create a for loop for int row equals 0. Row is less than grades.length. That gets me how many rows there are or how many students there are. Row plus plus. So in order to calculate the average, I do need to sum everything up. Double sum equals 0. So for each row, I already know the column number, which is what the assignment number is. So sum plus equal the row we're at, and then assignment number. Right? My average, your average is going to equal whatever your sum is divided by how many students there are. The number of students corresponds to how many rows there are in my matrix. So how do I get the number of rows?
Is it grades row that length?
Not row.length. If I do grades row.length,
Oh, grades that length.
yeah,
Grades that
just
length.
grades.length. If I do grades row.length, that'll give me how many columns there are, basically how many assignments. But I want to get how many students there are, which is how many rows.
Would also work. I'm sorry. Would also work. Like, let's just say you initialize the row variable outside the for loop,
Mhm.
and then you just use the row variable. Would that work too?
You can do that too. And so this method just returns the average. Close that method up. Close up my class. Now, if you remember with methods, in our method signature, we say public, whatever the return type is. For this one, it's a double because average is a double. So double get average score. Another thing to note, since we want to call this from the main, we must put in the static keyword as well. So we must have public static double because we want to call this from the main. Your main method is static as well. So I'll let that sit there for a second so you can look that over.
I have a question. Okay, so when we're in the for loops, right? The first row less than grades dot length, that just represents the grades going in as rows, right?
Right here.
Yeah.
So that's just counting down each row. We're just going to use that to go to each row. Grades.length
Okay, and
is
then
how
the
many
next
rows
one
there
is,
are.
oh, sorry.
I was going to say grades.length
Oh,
is how many
okay.
rows there are. And when I
Okay,
do,
and then for the,
I was going to say for the column, when I do grades index row.length, that gets me how many columns there are for this row. Does that make sense?
sort of.
So just to recap, this for loop loops through all of the rows. This for loop loops through all of the columns per row. So we do grades at, let's say, row 0 dot length. That tells me how many columns there are for row 0. If I do grades at row 1 dot length, that tells me how many columns there are for row 1. And then
Got it
grades at
now.
row 2. It makes sense now? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
And if you remember, we set how many columns there are, so each row should have the same amount of columns, but, you know, just to be safe. So this gets the average score for an assignment number, all right? So let's do let's loop through all of the actually, let's loop through and print out the array so we can see what the full table looks like. For int row equals 0. And actually, let's create a method for this. Public static void display table or display matrix double grades. I'm creating a method that'll display, basically print it to the console. All right. So I'm just going to copy these for loops because I don't feel like typing them again. Copy them down here. So we're going to have the same thing. So int row is less than grades.length. Int call is less than grades row.length, call plus plus. Instead of setting these equals to something, let's just print them out to the console. So system.out.println, or actually let's do print grades at whatever row, column, plus I'm going to put a space. And then system.out.println, just print line. Just add a new line at the end. Before I do that, I want to print out for int assignments, or let's see, call equals 0. Call is less than grades at row 0 dot length. Call plus plus. This is just to make it look pretty. I want to print out assignment whatever for each one. I'm just going to print out the whatever assignment we're at. System.out.print call plus a space. System.out.println. Basically, print out the assignment number. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then down here, we're going to print out their grades per student. So now let's call that method display matrix, pass in my grades array. So what I did is I called my display matrix method in my main. So I call display matrix, I pass in my grades. It goes down here to my display matrix method. First, it prints out the column numbers, so the assignment numbers. Then it prints out the grades for each student. And there are different ways of formatting it to make it look even better. I just don't feel like doing it. Final lecture. And of course, I have some errors. Let's see. Oh, I guess I do have to put the matrix grades at row column or row assignment number. So let's say there are 10 students, and remember 2 of those 10 students will have grades from 80 to 100, and there are 10 assignments. So here's all the student grades, and here's the column numbers. Again, there are different ways of formatting this to make it look even better. And here are the grades. So the first 2 students, again, they should have grades between 80 and 100, which looks like it's correct. Right? I don't see anything lower than an 80 or anything higher than a 100. The rest of the students, they have a more diverse set of grades, if you will. So this one has a 3, 89, 97, 16. Right? So 2 students perform at this level, and the rest of the students perform all across the board. Now you can modify this even more. Let's say we want to say 2 students average between 80 and 100. Then we want to say the middle pack of the students average between 30 and 80. And then the bottom, there's different ways that you can modify this program to give a more, statistical breakdown of students. But for this example, we just have 2 students that have between 80 and 100. Here's all their grades. So now let's average out, what's the grades for assignment 0? What's the average score? What's the average score for assignment 2, 3, 4, 5? I don't know. Let's find out. So we have a method that gets the average score for each assignment. So basically all we have to do is iterate through each assignment and print out the average. So remember column corresponds to each assignment. Equals 0. Call is less than grades. Let's say row 0 dot length. Row 0 is the first row, and we know all of the rows should have the same length, so this should be fine. Call plus plus. All right. So now let's print out the average for each assignment. System.out.print. The average grade for assignment. Let's concatenate in the assignment number column is concatenate in. We call our get average score method. We pass in our grades matrix, and then the column number, which is basically the assignment number. Close off that print line statement.
Question. Why do you have 0 after grades?
Right here. So I want to get the number of columns, basically how many different assignments there are. So in order to do that, I have to first access a row. And so I'm just saying row 0 by default. So I'm going to get grades at row 0. So the first student, essentially, how many assignments does that first student have? Because it follows that all of the rest of the students should have the same amount of assignments, right? So each student should have 15 assignments. Whether I take student 0 or student 1, they should have the same amount of assignments. So that's why I did grades at index 0. Up here, I did grades at row, but I could just as easily have done this right here, grades at index 0 as well. They all should have the same number of assignments. I run this. Let's say there are 10 students again, 15 assignments. So here are all of the students and their assignments. And here are the average scores for each assignment. So for each column, basically. Assignment 0, the average was a 67.9. So if I add up all of these scores right here, and I divide it by 15, I should get 67.9. If I add up all these scores right here, divided by 15, I should get a 53.7. So if you look, it looks like they all scored on average the best on assignment 2. All right. If you think about it, this is how a grade book works, right? Instead of doing it by column, we would do it by student, where I break it down. For this class, I have assignments and I have labs. I would take all of your assignment scores, right? All of your lab scores, and then assignment, I would do this, divide it by, let's say there are 5 assignments, 5 labs. I would add up all of your assignments, divided by 5. That would give me your average assignment score. Take all of your lab scores, divided by 5. That would give me your average lab score. And then the next calculation would be, what's the percentage of your overall grade for assignments and for labs? I think in this class, they both count for 20% of your grade. So then that's the next mathematical calculation that Moodle does, right? Somebody had to code Moodle, and they use the same math that we're doing right now. And to make this a little bit better looking, when I call display matrix, I want to get rid of these assignment headers. That looks weird. But I'm going to say system.out.print student, and then the row number, which is the student number, student 0, basically. And then print out all their grades. So now if I run this, it should look a little bit cleaner. So you see, now it says student 0. This is all their grades. Student 1, that's all their grades. Student 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way down to 10 or to 9. And then I'm averaging out each assignment. So for assignment 0, this is the average. Didn't do very well on assignment 0 on average. There are other things you can do with this, right? I could loop through and find which assignment did student 0 perform best on. It looks like if I look at this, it was this assignment, he got a 9, or they got a 99, and they got a 99 on this assignment, right? Which assignment on average did most people perform worst on? Looks like assignment 0. So as a professor, I need to reevaluate assignment 0, right? On average, they didn't do very well. I can look for assignment 5 right here, who performed the best? I would loop through this column, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I will loop through this column and see, all right, who had the best score? Print out that student's number, whoever had the best score. All right, there are many different things you can do with this code. Right? I can do the average scores, I can do the best scores, the worst scores, who performed the best. There are a lot of different things you can do as a programmer in order to modify this program as well. So everything we covered today, you will be doing, not everything, but a lot of things we covered today, you will be using on Friday and for your assignment. Now, your assignment is actually to create a scoreboard or a scoring table